So welcome everybody. This is our session, our Sappy Hour session about the Atlas data, the first of three sessions on how the Atlas data gets used for conservation purposes. And I'll be talking a little bit later about the following two presentations coming up in the next 2 weeks. But I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, as we do for our events. We have people joining the call from all across Ontario, which is the traditional territories of many different First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. I'm in Guelph, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Attiwarrenderek peoples. Guelph is also part of Treaty 3, or the Between the Lakes Purchase, which was a treaty signed in 1792 between the principal chiefs of the Mississauga Nation and John Graves Simcoe for the lands between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from all over Turtle Island. I encourage you to take a moment to learn more about the land that you're on and that you're atlasing on. Kaylin, do we have that link in the chat to the, okay.
I'll post.
Yeah, check in the chat, and there's a link there for a map showing the Indigenous lands across Ontario. Okay, so we're going to start the session soon. 3 different presenters. You are able to ask questions as we go along, but the questions, just write them into the Q&A section. If you're on Facebook Live, you can put it in your comments section, and Kaylin will copy that off across for us into the chat. Because this is an Atlas Sappy Hour, you can ask questions on the topics at hand, or if there's anything else interesting about atlasing you'd like to know, please feel free to ask at any time. We'll run through the questions at the end of the session. We're going to have the 3 presenters give the presentations, and then we'll deal with all the questions at the end. So we're very fortunate tonight to have 3 different speakers covering 3 different aspects of this, different ways that Atlas data are used. And I'll introduce, I think, them one at a time just before they do the presentation, so it's fresh in your mind when they begin. So I'll start with Kyle Horner, who's going to be talking about Nature Counts. Kyle is the Nature Counts Engagement Coordinator at Birds Canada, where he works to raise awareness and adoption of the platform for conservation and research. Kyle is a career science communicator, lifelong birdwatcher, and avid storyteller. He's based in Guelph, Ontario, and surveys a lovely Atlas Square near Mount Forest. And I can say he's also a key part of the Guelph Christmas bird count team. So Kyle's topic is on nature counts and your action in data, and I'm going to hand things over to you, Kyle.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Mike. And I'll get my screen up here. Hopefully everybody can see that. So yeah, hi everybody. It's great to be here this evening. My name is Kyle. As Mike said, I work for Birds Canada, and I work especially with the platform called Nature Counts, which is something that's probably at least a little bit familiar to everybody here as atlasers. It's either the name of the app that you use to submit your data, or maybe the name of the website where you upload your data. So probably you've at least heard a little bit about Nature Counts. Maybe you know a little bit more, maybe not so much. Either way, it's all good, because tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about Nature Counts and what it is and how it works, but also a little bit about what happens to your Atlas data after you click submit. So where does it go? What's it used for? I think kind of a good thing to know if you're atlasing. I will say, I think a lot of atlasers, and I would include myself in this when I started atlasing, are sort of happy to go out and do it because it's fun to do, and because we feel confident that it's probably a good thing. It probably contributes in a good way to our understanding of birds. And if that's all you need to know, then that's great. And I was quite happy atlasing that way for a long time. But I think it's very interesting as well to know a little bit more about where those data go. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about tonight. If when you're out atlasing, you at least have a sense that what you're doing is important, you would be correct. It definitely is. Get my slides moving here. The need for the kind of data that we're collecting when we atlas is recognized not only on a local scale, but all the way up to on a global scale as well. Some of you may be familiar with this biodiversity framework. This is a big document prepared by the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity in 2022, which basically sets out a bunch of targets that we need to achieve, we need to hit in order to conserve biodiversity on the planet and to prevent lost biodiversity. And there's a whole target dedicated to biodiversity-related data and how important it is to help us assess where we're at and then to save species, to save biodiversity going on into the future. And not only does this need for data get its own objective, but it also is cross-cutting because all of the other things that we want to do to help wildlife rely on having good, accessible data. So it's super important in terms of what we're doing to try to save wildlife. In terms of collecting that data, the best tool we have to collect large quantities of data about wildlife is citizen science, right? Is the network of people, and especially with birds, citizen science is incredibly powerful because there's so many people who go out and watch birds. You can imagine that generally the money supply to pay people to go out and research birds is always very small. And so having a huge network of knowledgeable and enthusiastic volunteers who want to go out and study birds and collect data is a hugely powerful tool. But that vast amount of data that citizen scientists collect brings with it its own problems. It's a huge amount of data just to handle and manipulate and do things with. The data are often spread out amongst lots of different citizen science projects. They can all be formatted in different ways because all these projects have their own protocols, their own methods, and they can be hard to find. You know, if I'm a bird researcher in Ontario and I want to collect data about birds from all these different projects, I have to know that they exist. I have to know where to find them. It's certainly possible that I might miss some. They're all very disconnected. So what we need is a tool that pulls all those data together and makes them easy to access. And that tool is Nature Counts. So that's exactly what Nature Counts is. It's an open data platform. It seeks to collect as much data as possible on the birds in Canada, keep it all in one place, and then turn it around and make it available to anybody who is trying to conserve birds in their habitats in Canada. It's really, really big too. So it's one of the largest repositories like this in the world. It currently houses, this is slightly out of date actually already, currently houses over 235 million records of birds. You know, so when you go out and you say, blue jay, and you put it on your list, that's one record. It contains over 235 million records like that of birds, which is a lot. That's a huge amount of data, and that's pretty exciting. We can think of the activities of Nature Counts in sort of three pillars. So the first pillar is collecting data. We've talked a little bit about that already. That's done through currently active citizen science projects like the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. But also there's lots of historical data sets that get incorporated as well. Like, for example, the first two Ontario atlases. You know, they weren't directly entered into the Nature Counts app, but they now exist in the Nature Counts repository as well, which is great because you can compare all three atlases, which is pretty handy. Once all those data are collected, Nature Counts interprets the data. So it, first of all, formats all the data exactly the same, one consistent format so that they can all be used together and compared to each other and used in the same analyses. It also produces some trend information and distribution information, some of which you can explore on the website through these maps, which is kind of a nifty way to play with the data and see what's in there. And so it tries to produce a data product, basically an output that everybody can use. And then finally, Nature Counts tries to drive impact. It tries to get people using the data, tries to get the right data in the hands of the right people to do good things for birds and their habitats. So that's, I think, the most interesting part from an atlasing perspective in a way is, well, what are your data used for? You're spending all this time and energy, all this effort to go out and collect the data. So what exactly are they used for? What are they doing? Well, they're used in lots of different ways. So Nature Counts data, including the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas data that it contains, they're used for species assessment. So one way to think about this would be species at risk. You know, when you have an endangered species or a threatened species, we need to assess that species to first determine if it is at risk. And then we need to continually assess it to see if it's getting more at risk or if it's doing better or worse. And so this kind of data are often used for that. And that's something that I think Danielle is going to speak to us a little bit about as well. So I won't go too in depth on that. But it helps us to see trends in the populations of these birds and sometimes to produce reports that you might be familiar with, like the 2019 report on the state of Canada's birds. You might have seen with those lovely graphs helping us to see how birds are doing in Canada. We see the data being used a lot in land planning, land use planning. So in some cases, this might be prioritizing land for protection, maybe by a government agency if they're trying to decide where to establish new parks and new conservation land in that way. through other initiatives like the Canada's Key Biodiversity Areas, which is a way to prioritize land that's important for biodiversity conservation and maybe for subsequent protection. Actually, those key biodiversity areas are a big part of Canada's commitments under that biodiversity framework that the United Nations established. We see it used to plan land use by nonprofits like land trusts, so land for private protection in that regard, and to understand the impacts of land use practices, like maybe agriculture, for example, so we can see how agriculture is affecting bird populations, and we can maybe make recommendations or incentivize land use that's good for birds. We see the data being used a lot for impact assessment. So that's what happens when maybe development is happening. So if you see a construction project happening near you, well, that construction project had to go through an impact assessment process where a consultant would come out and try to determine what's living there, what the sort of ecological situation is there, and how we can modify the project or adjust the project to be better for nature. That traditionally often has involved just somebody going out on a spring day or a couple spring days and counting the birds, which is great, but it's not as complete a picture as doing that and adding a whole bunch of data from nature counts about what lives there, what breeds there, maybe data that you've collected in your Ontario breeding bird atlas, right? So that's really, really useful. And it can actually, on the higher level as well, start to inform changes about policies and regulations regarding how these impact assessments are carried out. We see the data used a lot in education. So it's used to introduce university students, for example, to population research and open data. Another thing that Danielle is very much involved in. I'm not sure if she's going to mention that later or not, but super cool trying to get people at the university level already excited about open data. It's used a lot for graduate and undergraduate research projects. We see a lot of requests for that. And just to engage the public with birds in Canada as well, and through lots of different initiatives like those interactive maps and those reports and stuff too. And then we see it used in a lot of research. So you can imagine that this huge body, this mountain of data on birds is super valuable in terms of all kinds of different research that you can do. And when you think about bird research, you think about people out in the field studying birds, generating novel data, new data, but actually there's tons of things, tons of information, tons of knowledge to be gained from this existing data set. So if you're doing bird research, you might not even have to go out and study birds. You might be able to actually just look at this body of data and use it to learn lots of new and interesting things about birds and just about every subject matter about birds that you could imagine. I pulled 3 papers just out of curiosity that have specifically used Ontario breeding bird atlas data. They have the kind of titles that research papers tend to have, which makes them a little bit tricky to wrap your brain around. But that first one there is about using birds that live in agricultural areas as indicators of the health of those agricultural areas for nature, and trying to figure out a way to create this index so we can decide based on the birds that are living in an agricultural landscape if it's good for birds, if it needs to be improved, if there's something wrong. The second one is about land cover, so natural land cover as it compares to human disturbed land cover and how the birds use it and how it affects bird populations. So how we can manage land to be better for birds. And the third one is about wood thrushes specifically and why they're declining and what factors might be affecting their decline. So these are like really concrete and obvious ways that Ontario breeding bird atlas data is being used to help in bird research. I think that's really interesting. And we're getting lots of requests already for data from this atlas, from the third atlas, even though it's not finished yet. So your data are already being used, even if you just started atlasing for the third atlas, those data are already useful in terms of conservation and research about birds. I think as you're getting into year number 4 of the atlas, it's a bit of a long haul, but I think it's great motivation to know that what you're doing is really important and it has a practical use. It's getting used all the time and it's going to be used for years and years to come. There's a general consensus that in this global biodiversity crisis that we're experiencing, this kind of data is really, really crucial to understanding the threats to conservation and figure out what we need to do about it. So if you need an excuse to get out atlasing this year and to finish up all your surveys you're supposed to do and just spend lots of time out there surveying for birds, I think that's it. There's lots of great reasons to do it, and it's really, really important. If you want to learn more about nature counts beyond just using the app to submit your data, you can check out the website. There's some cool ways to visualize the data on there using those species maps and things, lots of information about the platform as well. So I certainly hope you'll check it out. And with that, I'll wrap it on up and I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Great. Thanks very much, Kyle. That was marvelous. Nice to have it put into the Atlas data put into context and know that when you're contributing to the Atlas, it's more than just the Atlas. It adds to all of the other things that Nature Counts is pulling together, and Nature Counts adds to what the Atlas is doing. So it's great to see. Thank you for that. I'm going to now, we'll move on to our second presentation. This is by Dr. Danielle Ethier, and she is the population scientist with Birds Canada. Her primary role is to unravel patterns and processes driving avian population dynamics using citizen science data sets collected by bird enthusiasts from across Canada. Through her position, she also serves as the quantitative specialist with COSEWIC's Bird Specialist Subcommittee and is the president-elect of the Society of Canadian Ornithologists. So welcome, Danielle. Are you able to share your screen and take us through your presentation? The title I have for Danielle's presentation is Using Citizen Science Data to Inform Species at Risk Decision Making.
Great, thanks for that wonderful introduction. I'm just getting my screen up. And I don't think that's full screen. Is that full screen for everyone now? I'm looking at you, Kyle, because I can see you. It looks good. Awesome. Yeah, so my presentation today is going to speak to how we use citizen science data broadly to inform species at risk decision making. So this is going to speak to one of those examples that Kyle had brought in as to how we use the data, that vast amount of data for this specific process. So my presentation is first going to speak, I'm just going to move my, oops. I'm going to move. Technical issues. Okay, first of all, I'm going to go over what is species at risk and how is their status determined, who is COSEWIC, and what is the role of the Bird Specialist Subcommittee, and specifically, how does your citizen science data contribute to status assessments in Canada? So first of all, what is a species at risk? So a species at risk essentially is a status designation that is assigned to any wildlife species by a governing body. And that governing body can be the federal government, or it can be a provincial government, or it can be a national designation by, say, the International Union for Conservation. In order for a species to be eligible for a status assessment, they have to meet three basic criteria. First of all, they have to be taxonomically valid, meaning they can't be a hybrid species. So if we have a hybrid between a wolf and a coyote, that's not a taxonomically valid species for an assessment. They have to be native to Canada. So species that are new residents to Canada, such as the opossum, are not eligible for a status assessment. And they have to be regularly occurring in Canada. So as birders, you know, sometimes weird birds get blown in on, you know, semi-regular occasions, and those birds aren't considered residents of Canada, and therefore they're not eligible to be assessed for a status designation either. There are 6 main categories which we designate species in Canada, and these status designations aren't just used in Canada, but they're used more broadly by other conservation organizations. The first 2, extinct and extirpated, means they either no longer exist globally or no longer exist in Canada. Species that are endangered and threatened receive the most amount of legal protection under our federal legislation. Species that are special concern are those that we're keeping an eye on that receive not as much legal protection, but are species that we do look at developing management plans for. And then there's species that can be assessed as data deficient, meaning we've made an assessment of how the population is doing, but we simply just don't have enough information to make a status designation. So some examples of status designations for some bird species in Canada are things like the piping plover. Both subspecies have been listed as endangered. Chimney swift has been listed as threatened, and the common nighthawk, which have been listed as special concern. So in order to assess the status of a species at risk in Canada, we use quantitative criteria. And these quantitative criteria are used by, again, not just Canada, but by the IUCN and by our provincial governments as well. So these are pretty standard quantitative metrics for making assessments. Quantitative meaning we generally need data and information to make these assessments. So these are criteria A through E, and they're based on things like the trends and how populations are doing, the distributional range of a population, the number of mature individuals, whether or not a population has a very small or restricted total Canadian population, or a quantitative analysis, so something like a population viability analysis. And we also take into consideration when making status designations any Aboriginal traditional knowledge and also expert knowledge of people that have worked with the species for long periods of time. And all this information feeds into how we might list the species under each of these criteria. Each criteria then is further broken down into subcategories. So just to say a population is declining isn't enough for us to say, is that population threatened or endangered? So I don't expect you to memorize any of this, but just to give you an impression that there is other sub-criteria that we use to make an assessment of whether a population's trend is declining, do we expect it to keep declining, and by how much it's declining, and the subcategories that we use to make assessments. And again, this is very heavily dependent on quantitative information, so on the data that's being collected. So for an example, the piping plover has been listed as endangered under the Species at Risk Act under criteria C2A2. So basically what this means is we know there's a small and declining number of mature individuals. Under subcategory 2, we know that there's continuing decline, which is observed, projected, or inferred in the number of mature individuals. A means they're fragmented, and that fragmentation, there's at least 95% of the mature individuals in only one population. So this is just an example of how, just because piping plover is endangered, there's further criteria that we use to actually make a designation kind of on a finer scale, and using that quantitative information. So what is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, and what's their role that they have to play? So COSEWIC is what we call it, the acronym, provides Canadians and their federal government with advice regarding the status of wildlife species and how they're doing nationally. So it's the federal regulating body, and they're really interested nationally, how is a population doing? It's an independent advisory panel to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. So this isn't a part of Environment Climate Change Canada, but an independent body that helps the government make those decisions. So this is a quick breakdown of how the process goes, and it's a very basic simplification, but so that you understand what the bird specialist subcommittee does and how that goes from the committee up to the minister. So each taxonomic group has its own specialist subcommittee. So actually Mike Burrell and I, who's also on this call, both sit on the bird specialist subcommittee. And we facilitate a lot of different things, but one of the things we do is what we call the candidate list. So this is a prioritization process to determine what species might be coming up for a status report. So what species look like they may not be doing well. We also commission the status reports, which are given externally to report writers to gather all the best available information from which we can use the quantitative criteria to make an assessment. That assessment goes up to what we call the COSEWIC Big Table, where all of the co-chairs from all the taxonomic groups get together and they take the assessment results from the specialist subcommittees and they make a recommended status designation. And this is done twice a year at the species assessment meetings. That status designation goes from now COSEWIC to the minister, and the minister can either agree with that status designation and list the species on Schedule 1 of the Species at Risk Act. Sometimes it takes a bit of time to get it there, or they might make slight changes to that status designation in the process. So that, in a very quick nutshell, is how information gets from sort of the bird specialist committee up to the minister's office. So how does citizen science data contribute to developing status assessments? So I don't need to go into great detail because I knew Kyle was speaking before me and I knew he was going to give you everything you needed to know about nature counts. But just to say that obviously Nature Counts is this great data portal for all of Canada's bird data, and all of that data, as Kyle mentioned, is stored in our database in a standardized format that's effort corrected, that gives us really strong data to make inference about how populations are doing, both spatially and temporally. So again, this data that are stored in Nature Counts, we have a lot of raw data, so just the count data that has really good spatial resolution, like our atlas data, where people are going out and really covering the landscape. And that kind of information can feed into different assessment criteria. So the distributional range of a species, how many mature individuals they are, is that population restricted? We can also then use some of the data that has better temporal resolution. So things like our breeding bird surveys, our Christmas bird counts, our marsh monitoring programs, our nocturnal owl surveys, and start looking at population trends. So as a population scientist, one of the things I do is use some of those data sets with good temporal resolution to see how populations are doing with time. All of this information also lives in the Nature Counts data portal. So therefore, we have all of the sort of quantitative information we need in one data repository that can help us start making assessments for species at risk. So what does this look like? So citizen science data, therefore, lives in the Nature Counts portal. That goes, we can push this through what we call through the R package, and R is a statistical software language. And from that, in my position with the bird specialist subcommittee as a quantitative specialist, I've been able to write workflows that allows us to take the data from Nature Counts directly through R and into a workflow that then gives the quantitative information the bird specialist subcommittee needs to make their candidate list. But this information can also be given to report writers when they need to compile the information for those status reports. So I was going to end this with an example, a very solid example of how we've used breeding bird atlas data recently to really inform a COSEWIC process that is called a rapid review. So a species that's previously been listed, and if we don't expect that the status has changed, but it's up for a new status report, so every 10 years a species should be re-reviewed. If we don't expect the status has changed, then we can make a rapid review of the quantitative information and determine if the status will be the same. So because a lot of our atlasers are using the Nature Counts app, that data goes straight from the app into the data portal. I can pull it through R and I can make that quantitative assessment almost on the fly now to say, where are the birds, where have they been seen, what's their distribution, and how many do we think they are? And because of that, we are able to make a quick assessment of king rail in this instance to say that, yes, we expect king rail are still going to be listed as endangered moving forward. So that's it. I don't think we're taking questions now, but I do want to end by, thanking all of our atlasers and all of our data enthusiasts, because certainly collecting these types of data have, direct impact on how we make assessments to species at risk and how we understand populations over space and time.
Great, thanks very much, Danielle. That was wonderful. Great introduction to how the atlas data can be used by COSEWIC. Our third presentation tonight is by Dr. David Isles, and Dave is a biostatistician with the Canadian Wildlife Service, where he analyzes data to help understand how bird populations are distributed across Canada and how they are changing through time. Before joining CWS, his research took him to northern Manitoba to study common eiders, lesser snow geese, and polar bears, to the eastern United States to study bumblebee nesting, and to Antarctica to survey penguins. And I should say that Dave is sort of taking the lead on the analysis of the statistical analysis of the atlas data, so he's a great person to be talking to you tonight. The title of his presentation is Analyzing Bird Populations Through Time and Space. And Dave, I can hand things over to you.
Fantastic. And can you hear me and you can see my screen? Everything looks good?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming here and inviting me to talk about this. And like Mike said, I'm a biostatistician with Environment Climate Change Canada. I'm here in Ottawa. And one of my responsibilities is taking all the data that you collect and trying to make the most of it and feeding it into statistical models to give us estimates of species distributions and trends over time. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, but I promise this isn't going to be a stats lecture, and I've had to really try hard not to include any equations in this talk, so because nobody wants to see that. That's 7:30 on a Thursday. Okay, and I guess one of the first things I just want to mention, and I think this is obvious to everyone here, is that breeding bird atlases are valuable for many different reasons, not just because we can build really beautiful maps of bird distributions and understand their trends through time, but they have value far beyond that. Like Kyle mentioned, they're really important for engaging the public and fostering that appreciation and that stewardship of birds and their habitats. And they support just basic research and education. We learn many new things about bird ecology through atlases. And then they're useful for mapping bird distributions and discovering their habitat associations, characterizing and identifying biodiversity hotspots, and then assessing population status and trends. So how many birds are there and how are they changing through time? And that's a way that we monitor the health of these populations. And then finally, like Kyle also talked about, they're super useful for informing conservation and management. We can use them for many different aspects in terms of conservation, like designating protected areas and so forth. Well, occasionally, people might ask, like, what do we really need breeding bird atlases in the era of, eBird and big data, and why are they still so valuable? And I've had to respond to this question occasionally, and I like to point people to these kinds of figures showing that atlases, in addition to all of their uses for education and fostering outreach, they just generate an incredible amount of data that isn't available in non-atlas years. And so hopefully you forgive me, because you can see at the end of this figure, there is another year of data available here that isn't on this figure, but the blue bars are the atlas years, and these show the number of point count surveys in non-atlas years versus atlas years. And so it's just clear immediately that these atlas years generate a ton of extra data that are super valuable for understanding bird populations. In cases like Ontario, where there's multiple atlases conducted through time, that also gives us a really great way to detect population trends. So in addition to the amount of data that they collect, they're also really great at understanding like where that data is collected and where birds are distributed. So in this case, this is an example of just breeding evidence of eastern loggerhead shrikes. And you can see that in the 5 years preceding the second Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas and the 5 years after it, there's really few observations of breeding evidence of that species. And then during that atlas, there's quite a lot. And this atlas data is just incredibly useful for that reason, is that we get that much higher quality, much higher spatial precision on our data during those years. One of the features of atlas data is that there's quite a lot of differences across the provinces, and this is especially the case in Canada, as opposed to some of the United States that also have state breeding bird atlases. But Canada is really different in this way, is that we have most of our population, our human population, concentrated in the southern parts of our provinces. And so we have this really wide range of survey effort, high survey effort in the south and progressively less survey effort in the north. But the atlas is a way of distributing as best we can that survey effort across the province. The reason that we need statisticians and statistical models to analyze this data is because even though the atlas is great at increasing the amount of data that we're collecting, and so important for that, we need ways to say or to try to estimate what's happening in these pockets of the province that aren't surveyed. And so we build statistical models to try to extrapolate, or we also use the word interpolate, between the points that are surveyed and give us better estimates of what's happening in the areas where we don't have surveys. And your data is what's critical for doing that. So this slide is the only slide I'm going to have about the actual data analysis itself, and I'm not going to get too much into the details here. It was really tempting to try to put a whole bunch of slides about the analysis, but really the gist of it is that, and this is where I spend most of my time, is building these statistical models. And so these models are meant to give us better estimates of species distribution and trend. We're building these models that integrate data from multiple different data sources. And as you know, there's many different types of data that you can collect during a breeding bird atlas. So the models that I've been developing in collaboration with many other folks, some of them on this call, in collaboration with Danielle and Mike, they integrate data from point counts and checklists and increasingly acoustic recordings, which are just a great way to get sometimes even non-bird experts to be able to collect recordings in the field that can then be analyzed later by experts. So it's a great way to increase engagement. That data can all be brought into a statistical model. And then what we try to do with our models is correct for survey effort. So some areas have a ton of survey effort and they see a lot of birds, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot more birds there. So we need to correct for that. We account for spatial and temporal relationships in the data, the fact that there's pockets of data with lots of effort and there's pockets of data with not lots of effort. And then we also try to relate this information that's coming from these data sources to habitat variables, things that we know or we think are affecting the bird populations and where they're located. We also are making use of more and more sophisticated statistical models that can use and bring in expert knowledge. And so this, we recognize, we know a lot about birds. Birds are one of perhaps the best studied group of organisms on the planet. We know a lot about them. And so some of these more recent statistical models can actually make use of that expert knowledge. We use these to predict species distributions across the province, describe species range boundaries, measure changes in abundance through time. And then this is one of the really important points that we're especially going to try to bring into this next Ontario Atlas, but communicating uncertainty. And this is important because we can generate maps and they might look really beautiful, but we also need to acknowledge that there can be quite a lot of uncertainty in our maps. And we don't want to give the false impression that because the map says that if you go to this particular area of the province, there might be, a certain number of this species of bird. We need to actually put sort of what we call confidence limits on that and say it could be anywhere from, this up to here and anywhere in between. And so that's a really important part of the statistical modeling is communicating that uncertainty. So we do all that by building mathematical relationships between all these different components, and then we feed them into computer programs. And so I spend quite a lot of time writing out computer code. And I've shrunk this down so that it's not even legible, so you're not even tempted to try to read it because nobody wants to do that. Okay, I want to show a couple examples of some of the outputs from these models. I was hesitant also to even present these because these are still a work in progress. And one of the features of building these types of statistical models, bringing in this data, is that this is a long process and it's an iterative process. We build these models, we generate outputs, and then we have species experts and data experts look at these maps and assess them, and then identify problems with them. And then we bring it back into the modeling, correct any issues that we have, send them back out. And it's like a cycle that happens over and over. And it can happen during the atlas. And that can actually help guide guide recommendations for where we need to do more sampling. So we might discover there are areas of the province where our predictions are looking really weird. And that might tell us, okay, well, if possible, we can go out and collect more data, get better predictions in those areas and tighten up these models. So this is a map of relative abundance predictions for Canada warbler. There's tiny little black dots. You may not be able to see them, but those are the locations where Canada warbler were detected in Atlas surveys in Ontario Atlas 3. And then the darker patches are areas where we predict there's just higher density of Canada warbler. Like I mentioned, one of the things we're really trying to do for this atlas is incorporate uncertainty into this. And so this is a map not of density of Canada warblers, but our uncertainty in the density of Canada warblers. It's a bit of a tongue twister. The darker areas are the areas where there's wider uncertainty bounds. And so we might, in areas that are really light colored or white, we might be really certain there's almost no Canada warbler there. In the areas that are darker, we might say there's anywhere from 1 to 1.5 Canada warblers for every 10 point counts you do. So these are the kinds of uncertainty bounds that we're trying to communicate and represent with our maps. One of the other ways that we can represent some of these outputs is through the probability of observation maps. So you've seen these before. And these just are a really intuitive way of representing two birders. If you go out and you conduct a certain number of point counts, or you conduct a certain number of checklists, or you invest a certain amount of effort into searching in different parts of the province, what's the probability that you're actually going to see that species? Now, this isn't Ontario, this is from the Maritimes Atlas, but one of the other important types of maps that we're building for Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas 3 is maps of change through time. And we can do this because now we're on the third atlas. So here's an example from the Maritimes Atlas, of which there were two of them, that show on the left was the probability of observation during the first atlas. In the middle is the probability of observation in the second atlas, so 20 years later. And then you can subtract those two surfaces, those two maps, and you get the map that's all the way on the right. And the redder areas are areas where the probability of observation has gone up, and the blue areas are areas where the probability of observation has gone down. So that gives us some indication that populations have changed, and where they've changed, and how much they've changed. Instead of just modeling, though, the change in the probability of observation, what we would like to do, and what we're aiming to do for Ontario Atlas 3, is model actual changes in the relative abundance of birds, because that's a much more useful metric for conservation. It's a much more useful metric for COSEWIC. And it also gives a really great sort of sanity check and comparison to some of our other long-term monitoring projects, like the Breeding Bird Survey, like the Christmas Bird Count. The Atlas is a nice independent way to verify the trends that we're getting out of these other programs. I don't have change maps ready yet for Ontario Atlas 3, so that's why I'm showing Maritimes. This is my last slide, and Kyle covered this really nicely, but the outputs from these types of analyses can be really useful for conservation. On the left is a map showing important bird areas, and these are areas that are identified to be important for birds, either because they are areas that contain species at risk, or they contain high biodiversity areas. And so they can be really useful for identifying those kind of biodiversity hotspots or areas that are important for conservation. And then on the right, this fairly pixelated figure that I've included here, they can also be really useful for impact assessments and regional assessments. And so this is an example where there's a really contentious and widely publicized regional assessment in Northern Ontario, just west of James Bay, called the Ring of Fire. And what we can start to do with these maps and through the collection of Atlas data is build baseline estimates of bird density and distribution throughout these areas that we know or we think could be developed for mining, could be impacted by forestry, and could be impacted by climate change. And so we can have some way of saying, we think this is where the populations are, and these are the areas that are going to be most sensitive to changes. Okay, well, that's the end of my talk. I may have just breezed through that really quickly, I'm not sure, but thank you so much for watching, and happy to take questions.
Great, thanks very much, David. That wonderful to see those early maps of relative abundance coming out from the Ontario Atlas already. So I have to say, in previous atlases, it was a couple of years after the atlas was over by the time we were able to put out any maps showing relative abundance. So it's nice that you're on top of that, way ahead of schedule. So it's time to open things up for questions, but first I want to introduce Mike Burrell, who's the coordinator of the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. He's going to be sitting in on the panel and answering questions, and Kaylin Bumelis, who's working behind the scenes, making sure things are running smoothly. She's the project manager for the Atlas project and vital to its operations. So you can put your questions into the Q&A, and I think there's a couple of questions in there already. If you're on Facebook, you can put the questions into comments, and Kaylin will handle them from there. So I'll just go through and start looking at some of these questions. See what we've got. So a question from Kai Milliard around Kosiwik. How on earth is the minister qualified to decide if a recommendation should be accepted or rejected? I'm going to hand that one to Danielle.
That's a really great question. I'm not here to judge the qualifications of the minister, so that's my qualification. I don't know, and Mike, you might be able to speak to this as well since you sit with the Bird Special Subcommittee. I don't think that the minister generally changes the recommendations made by Kosiwik. I think when the Kosiwik assessments go to the minister, they generally are accepted. Sometimes the time lag between when Kosiwik makes a recommendation and when the minister actually decides to list or not list a species can take time. But you know, I trust that the minister has advisors that are qualified to help make that decision as well. So yeah, I don't know, Mike, I don't think there's many instances where that ranking is, or that designation is changed.
Yeah, that's above my pay grade.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah, pretty unusual for not to go through for birds. It's more often, if it does happen, it's for species that have some sort of like, there'd be a big commercial or economic impact of the listing.
Yeah.
The minister might consider in terms of whether or not to accept, but yeah.
Yeah. Caribou and like fisheries are kind of probably the more contentious areas than birds, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Whoops. Next question, is the candidate list for Kosiwik assessments available to the public? I guess, Danielle, back to you again.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I did just check because I saw that come up earlier. So I can post, would it be best to post in the Q&A an answer to that, Kaylin? I can post a link to the candidate. It's publicly accessible. You can see how the candidate list process is, like, what are the guidelines for the candidate list process? And then every year after our summer meeting by, I think, January, the candidate list is made publicly accessible. So I can post those links to close that Q&A. Does that work?
Yeah, I mean, you can, if you post it in the chat, I can also copy it and
Okay.
post it into Facebook as well.
Okay, so how about I put it in the chat and then everyone can have it there. But good question.
And I see there's two questions that Kyle answered by typing it out. Mike, I don't know if you want to go over those so that anyone watching the recording might have access to them as well.
Are they in the chat?
They're in the Q&A, but just in the answered section.
Oh, okay. All right.
And I can remember them, Mike, if you, if you want me just to rehash a little bit there. It caught me being a bit of an eager beaver and typing answers. But the first question was about whether Nature Counts incorporates iNaturalist data, and it does. So all research grade records from iNaturalist are imported into Nature Counts, as is eBird data. So if you're eBirding, your data wind up in Nature Counts too. So thank you for that. And then the second question, kind of related to that, is about whether at the end of the atlas, you should or could still use the Nature Counts app to collect data in the field. And the app is actually, it's based on a project. So that Ontario Birding Bird Atlas being one project, which uses the app, there are others as well. But once that project is done, you won't be able to use the Nature Counts app to continue to collect data because the project is over. But you can continue to eBird, and your eBird data will then end up in Nature Counts as well. So if you want to keep collecting data in the field, definitely keep eBirding. That's the best way to do it.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, there was one more question here. As Kaylin says, not exactly in line with most of our topics, but I may as well post it out and see if anyone has an answer to it at this point. So the question, I can't see who it's from, but the question is, do nest box programs give a concrete input to population trends, or is there more chance of false positives or negatives for species that use nest boxes?
Are you going ahead, Mike? You unmuted first. Go ahead.
No, go for it.
I was just gonna. I don't know if you or David can think of an example. Like, there's no reason. Like, I haven't personally seen NestBox program be used for population trend analysis, but maybe Mike, you can think of an example where it has been. But I can't think of an example where we've used those data specifically.
I was thinking back to the early days of seeing the first bluebird, the Eastern bluebird account way back when, not really used for trend analysis per se, but for getting an idea of the overall number of boxes that were being occupied. That kind of thing was important back in those days, before a lot of the other quantitative data was available.
And I was in an OBBA meeting, an Ontario Bird Banding Association meeting last winter, where they had a lot of the NestBox stuff being shown. So it's definitely something people are still doing, but I haven't, maybe it's something to consider.
Yeah, I would guess that before they can be used for population, I also agree. I haven't seen them used for population trend analysis, but they could probably be useful for range, like measuring or monitoring range shifts and seeing species moving, across the landscape. Probably, but it's really hard to analyze that data for population trend itself.
Yeah, there's a question from Brian. Oh, sorry, Mike, were you going to add to that?
Hey, yeah, Brian Barkley posted in there with the question about purple martins, and they would be a prime one that you probably could do that. I don't know, maybe in BC they've done that to use the NestBox monitoring numbers, but I'm not sure if that has actually been used. But it would be a species, that would be one of the prime species you could do that for, because virtually the entire population nests in artificial boxes. Definitely other studies out there using NestBox monitoring programs to monitor like population metrics. So like how well the species is doing. But yeah, I don't know. There's got to be somebody that's done it with nest boxes.
Okay, it's a question from an anonymous attendee, and it is, how do international counts of species that exist outside of Canada affect species status at the level of threatened, endangered, etc.? I guess that's back to you, Danielle.
And since Mike's here, I'll let him chime in too. But, for populations, because birds are migratory, they don't spend their entire annual cycle in Canada. If there's other evidence we can use. So it's not just how is the Canadian population doing, but if the population if we have evidence that it's crashing elsewhere, but it breeds in Canada, or it migrates through Canada and uses Canada for a part of its life cycle, other information certainly can be used to inform a species status assessment in Canada. So it's not just necessarily the data we collect in Canada, but if we have data throughout other parts of the annual cycle, that can certainly be important to helping us assess status.
Yeah, at our bird specialist subcommittee meetings, we a big part of what we're doing is debating what information is the most applicable. So if it's a species that's not well surveyed by, for instance, breeding bird atlases or the breeding bird survey in Canada, because it nests further north than any of those programs monitor, then we might look at migration monitoring data from migration hotspots like Long Point, or we might look at Christmas bird count trends on the wintering ground. So like a species like horned grebe, we assessed recently, and we ended up relying heavily on Christmas bird count data of the birds in the United States, because there's not very many that spend the winter in Canada. Red knot is another example that was recently assessed, and there's some good surveys of migration counts in Canada, but the best information came from the wintering grounds and the changes in population on the wintering grounds.
So Mike, maybe while you're there, I'll just get you to deal with the next question, which relates to just what you were saying. The anonymous attendee is asking, what about bird banding data? How does that get used in population trends?
Yeah, the way that we use it on the Kosiwik Birds subcommittee would be those migration monitoring counts, and Danielle can speak way more to this than I can. But those banding data are part of, like, they help inform the population trends, indices. I think you call them migration indices. So I'll pass that over to Danielle because she can speak way more to that than I can.
Yeah, and actually David's on the call too. So he's also one of the people who's working on methods to compile trends from across many stations so that we can get national assessments of birds from migratory stations. But just to keep it simple, like there's lots of different trend programs, and migration monitoring is one of many trend programs that we have. So when we make an assessment of a species, we do have to make, like Mike said, an assessment of which program gives us the best information, and then it's a weight of evidence too. Like if all the trend station, all of our bird banding stations are CMMN stations, which stands for the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network, are all showing something similar for a population, we might be able to, you know, have we'll have more confidence that that's actually what's happening with the population. So they are part of the SSC's decision-making process, and they are they do feed into the state of Canada's birds, not often as the primary program, but they can be used as another program to kind of, if they need other lines of evidence. And then, yeah, David is working on some new modeling techniques to help us get at that bigger picture national assessment using that data set. And hawk count stations are kind of in that same realm.
Great. Okay. Thanks a lot, Danielle. Another question from Kai Milliard for Dave. He wants you to, you probably see it there, he wants you to show you the equations, show him the equations. Maybe you could do that privately. But can you say more about how the Atlas data help validate BBS data?
Sure. Yeah. And like Mike said, if you do want to dig into some of the math and the stats behind all this, I'm happy to nerd out about that at any point. So just email me about that. But in terms of validating our trend information from the BBS or from any other monitoring program, there's this idea that you can, if you have multiple relatively independent monitoring programs that are all giving you the same estimate, the same answer, they're all telling you that the population is declining at a similar rate, that gives you much, much more confidence than if it just comes from a single source. And so the BBS is perhaps the best long-term trend monitoring information that we have for birds in North America. It's so fundamental to how we monitor land birds. But it does have its limitations. It doesn't extend north into the boreal forest, and it's a road-based survey. So a lot of Canada is not roaded, and we have a ton of birds in the unroaded parts of Canada. And so when we get trends from the breeding bird survey, we have to remember that those trends are from the areas that we're monitoring, which are the roaded parts. But for the national assessments that Danielle is interested in and Environment Canada needs to report on, these also encompass the areas that aren't monitored by the BBS. And so the awesome thing about the Atlas is that there are paid crews and volunteers, and there's Indigenous communities, First Nations, that are participating in the Atlas and the data collection all across Ontario that are fundamental to it. And that gives us a way to estimate trends in parts of the province that don't have BBS data. And it also gives us a way, just a second independent check over the 20 years, is the trend similar to the BBS? So it's really useful.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that, Dave. And sorry, everybody, we've come to the end of our hour. So just want to thank very much our panelists, David Isles and Danielle Etier and Kyle Horner, to Mike Burrell and Kaylin for helping out with the panel discussion. Remind everybody that there's a session next week, same time, same channel, on the second component of this, diving deeper into the applications of the Atlas data, looking particularly at habitat change and modeling. And then on the 22nd of February, again, same thing. The third component of this is Atlas data and land management. So getting down into the weeds on the different ways that the many different ways that the Atlas data is getting used. So a reminder to everybody that the today's presentation is available on the Atlas YouTube channel. And otherwise, I think it's just good night and happy atlasing.
Thanks, everybody.
Everyone, have a great night.